Invasion Audiobook, Part 22. Pvt Li Chung and his entire battalion, in which he served within, was thrust into battle against the 2nd American Defense Line within the Cap City early into day number 3 to hit the key node of St. Elizabeth's campus, the headquarters of the Homeland Security paramilitary element of the Americans. Also there, of course, were mixed military forces present on the campus as well to aid in guarding this major strong point on the 2nd defensive line, in order to attempt to hold out as long as was humanly possible. The forces holding this shorter defense line were able to do much more than those who'd fought on the 1st defense line could, as the 2nd line had much more time to be better developed, as also did the 3rd belt of defenses right behind it, as well as the fact that any retreating Americans from the now defeated 1st defense line took up position alongside of and added their manpower to those holding the 2nd line. The forces in the eastern suburbs were now being brutalized in the worst of ways, as that section of the metro area had thus far, in the preceding 2 days of the invasion, been a sort of bulwark against the invasion forces due to the higher concentration of nearby forces of National Guard, Navy, paramilitary, as well as even some Air Force personnel who'd retreated from the outer ring of installations on day number 1 while retreating from Andrews, their home installation. These forces took cover in the subway, the Metro Line, as it was called, whenever intense Chicom strategic air raids or artillery barrages leveled it into dust, thus returning above ground afterwards to keep up the fight. The 93rd Infantry Division's 1-tank battalion of the division was used to outflank the American defenders in this area upon the fall of the 1st defense line, allowing them to press into the eastern suburbs by moving southeast from their recent gains in the northwest near the Supreme Court complex recently captured by them. This unexpected turn of events began to squeeze the eastern suburbs' defending forces into an even smaller pocket, and was even cutting them off from the 2nd defense line's key node at St. Elizabeth's complex. The Mechanized Infantry Battalion, of which Pvt Li was a part of, was tasked out specifically with attacking the 2nd defense line near St. Elizabeth's from the north, moving south against it, while the Belarusian tank battalion of its 11th Motor Rifle Brigade attacked from the south at the very same time. If they broke this key fortress node, they'd then have punched a hole through the 2nd defense line in a very key location, thus allowing quick access on to attack the 3rd and final line, which sat literally in some cases right upon key regime buildings, among other locations within the regime quarter. This was the largest main and final prize of the CCP, and was to serve as their ultimate propaganda coup. But first, the 2nd line needed to be breached, and this wouldn't be an easy task, as this line was well established after nearly 2 days of preparation. Now, Lee's company of his Mechanized Infantry Battalion advanced to within range of the complex itself, but from across the Anacostia River. on their side of it. They immediately were opened fire upon as they sought a way to cross the river, with Battalion Tactical Operations Center informing Lee's company captain that there were no viable bridges left in operation in the immediate area, minus the toll bridge, which was behind the second line of defense, there to be used by American defenders to cross the Anacostia at will. As this bridge hadn't yet been blown by the defenders, so as to again allow their forces to move to and fro while behind the second line. The Battalion Tactical Operations Center also informed Lee's and the other companies in the battalion that their engineering platoon belonging to the battalion headquarters, or the divisional headquarters battalion, would be sent along with scissor bridges, but it would take a few hours for them to retrieve the bridges from CCP properties that lay right outside of the city and return to the combat zone in order to be able to lay them across the Anacostia River in the area facing the opposite side of the second defense line. For the meantime, they had to make attempts to punch through some of the other sections of the line on their side of the river, the goal of which was to be able to punch through and take the toll bridge intact, so as then to be able to cross at will and seize St. Elizabeth's compound from the northwest upon crossing to attack it. The complex was a fortress with its former gardens and wood plots cratered and ruined from the massive ordnances that had struck, with massive ditches and trenches and foxholes and even bunkers dug therein amid the craters. There even were anti-tank ditches which bottlenecked approaching vehicles to where they were relegated to the roads entering and leaving the complex. This presented a huge issue which only scissor bridges over the obstacles could even fix, or they could take their chances on the roads into and out of the complex while attacking. For the time being, that was mainly a Belarusian issue, as their tank battalion moved forward upon the cessation of a heavy artillery barrage, and also the eastern suburbs being smashed once more by another strategic air raid coming from the 3 H-6Ks flying overhead of the PLAAF. The combo was beyond what words, total devastation, could even imply. There were no words that could accurately even articulate what happened to not only the city, but specifically the eastern parts of it. Pvt Li was in the back of his armored personnel carrier, ready for battle once more. He knew damn well that everything he was about to undergo would be drastically more intense than that which he'd already just experienced up to that point. This line of defense would be no joke, to be certain. Already, the Americans reemerged upon the end of the massive artillery barrages and air raids launched by the Chicoms. They were in position and ready for the fight of their lives. Man and machine would soon be tested and ravaged to their very limits. Already, the turret gunners were letting loose upon firing upon hostile positions amid all the rubbled ruins of the city, set up to be a modern-day palisade against the enemy invasion forces. Americans here had anti-tank positions, machine gun nests, and even scattered mortar pits as well. They'd saved some of their best still available weapons for this particular defense line. Unfortunately, the mortar ammunition was lacking, but they used what they could, waiting for clusters of enemy infantry to emerge before deciding to utilize such weapons. These came from old local National Guard stocks, which had been collecting dust in the armories, as well as a small few crates of mortars for said mortar tubes. These M224 mortars were of the 60 millimeter variety, which was moderately powerful, albeit largely against lighter targets like ground troops or soft positions and soft-skinned vehicles. However, it wasn't so effective against more heavily armored targets, but that notwithstanding, it was still a somewhat overall effective weapon when put in the right hands, as well as depending on how it was also deployed. The anti-tank systems in use by the defenders ranged from tow systems and even a few javelins intermixed with the more numerous and simpler AT-4 recoilless shell systems. M250 caliber machine guns served as the heavy machine gun of choice of the defending forces, as well as general purpose machine guns such as the 240 Bravo and in some cases even 240 Charlie, commonly used by helicopter door gunners in better times. The Americans fired vigorously at the approaching PLA forces of Pvt Li's company as they got nearer to the second line. Rounds smacked into the vehicle, bouncing off as they hit. The turret gunners on the vehicles continued firing, returning what was dished out upon them. The battle grew more intense as the battalion's fire support company now got involved, setting up their 2 rocket platoons and 1 PLL-05 dual assault gun / heavy mortar platoon. They laid down devastating firepower on the American positions in front of Pvt Li's company, but it only managed to KIA some of the Americans who, by this point, were exceedingly well dug in and prepared within their rubbled positions. This fight became more and more intense as Lee's company deployed their infantry fighting vehicles into the battle, who fired their 30 millimeter auto cannons with explosive tipped ammunition and even a few anti-tank missile pods they had on the sides of the turrets, along with their 100 millimeter cannons, lobbing these large 100 millimeter shells into American fortifications. The Americans responded by first deploying AT-4s, which did little to the vehicles when hitting head-on, but it served to damage one of the infantry fighting vehicles, as well as to take out the driver of an armored personnel carrier by crashing into the driver's section and managing to eliminate upon impact the driver himself. Many missed their marks, however, having been hastily fired amid heavy machine gun fire coming from the Chicoms, attempting to fire fast and then get back into relative safety of their positions. The added explosive reactive or applique plating on the Chicom vehicles minimalized the damage of the AT-4s that did manage to score hits, although it wasn't always a certainty that the anti-tank weapons would hit the up-armored areas of the vehicles, which is why the company captain gave the order to not turn the vehicles but face head-on to minimize the effectiveness of those weapons. The medics, having a hell of a task, ran to the back of the APC that had been hit with its driver eliminated and grabbed his corpse from the back of the now disabled vehicles, having been passed through the driver's hatch out of the back hatch from its occupants in the troop cab, with the gunner of this APC continuing to fire, as he had managed to dip into the vehicle for cover upon the AT-4 appearing and firing that struck the APC. The men of the squad still in the back, still having radio access amid the damage, were told to stay put and shelter inside the vehicle until further orders. This order horrified the men still inside, as they knew another direct hit in the same spot could take them all out. However, fortunately for them, 2 infantry fighting vehicles moved forward and blocked the path of the now disabled armored personnel carrier to protect it. Now the hellish combat grew even more and more intense, as the second line proved already to be a stubborn line indeed. The Americans holding this line were fighting very skillfully and doing their best to hold the line from the savage attack now being pressed upon them. The rockets fired from the 2 platoons of the Fire Support Company, along with the heavy mortar shells from the dual-purpose PLL-05s, crashed into the second line in the area of where the attack was commencing, as other companies of other battalions, and as well as Lee's battalion, were pressing into other areas along the second defense line, adjacent to where Private Lee's company was for the time being, but to the right of them, further away from the Anacostia, as Private Lee's company was hitting the line nearest to the toll bridge with the intent to capture it intact, then move across and hit St. Elizabeth's from the northwest side of the Anacostia River. The turret gunner on Private Lee's armored personnel carrier kept firing, running through can after can of 12.7 millimeter ammo for the heavy W85 machine gun, but the battalion had restocked on ammo, MREs, water, and refueled upon completing their tasks earlier on the first defense line in preparation for the assault on the second line, now underway. Logistically, they were well stocked, but by now the fight had bogged down into a long trading of fire between both sides, with little achieved thus far by this. There were obstacles everywhere in front of the PLA forces as they sought an easy way through and could find none. The Americans had moved the hulks of destroyed civilian vehicles into piles that obstructed the path towards the second line's fortifications. Interspersed within the obstacles of rubble were rubbled dragon's teeth, being a more primitive version of such, but made of rubble, as bands with bands of concertina and barbed wire strung together to obstruct the advance of any potential infantry forces or dismounts. Truly, the situation was now indeed a mess. To be able to punch through would involve intense fighting and obstacle clearance operations. The same combat engineer company, which was part of the division's headquarters battalion, who was tasked out to bring the scissor bridge to cross the river if the toll bridge couldn't rapidly be captured, would be quite busy indeed. Not only would the engineers be laying the scissor bridge, but they'd also be called upon to clear some of the obstacles blocking the way to the American defensive positions themselves. To even do so would involve massive teamwork between the mechanized infantry companies of their respective battalions, with the engineer company of the headquarters battalion of the entire 92nd Infantry Division. News came in via radio that upon the taking of the Walter Reed Army Hospital on the first defensive line earlier, division intelligence reports estimated that some 500 defenders made it to the second defense line upon them retreating from the first. Bad news, to be sure. However, be that as it were, the fight had to continue, and the trading of fire went on for many hours. Vehicles moved forwards, shooting, and backwards, doing the same, in order to make them slightly more difficult to hit by the Americans. due to the Americans being forced to reassess the range at which enemy targets were as they continued to move and shift. Rounds smacked into vehicles, almost like popcorn. The gunner shields of the turret gunners were dented beyond all belief, having been hit by numerous rounds of various American calibers. It was a nerve-wracking experience for the PLA troops currently involved in the assault, as the rounds hit so much that the gunners wondered if they'd be hit themselves at any moment. Private Lee waited in his APC with the rest of his squad. All the men were mostly silent, except for Private Quing, who was bouncy and amped up, every so often asking the sergeant if he thought that they'd be called out for an attack soon. The sergeant looked at Private Quing like he was a madman and simply shook his head in response, saying nothing to Private Quing, except at one point saying, "We go when they give the order." Private Quing finally calmed down a bit upon hearing this and looked at Private Lee, who was his friend, and asked him what he thought about the situation. "Quing, you need to calm down. You're so young. You don't want to die out there, do you?" To which Private Quing responded, "I'm always ready to die for China and for Xi." He legitimately seemed enthusiastic upon saying such, as all PLA troops revered their emperor for life and their country. Private Lee was a patriot, but he was older and more mature and had a family to live for back in China. "Listen, Quing, you can die for China after you survive the war as a hero of China. We are making history, and it's something you'll want to make out the other end of," responded Private Lee to Private Quing in a thought-out, measured response. Other privates in the squad sitting in the troop cab of the armor personnel carrier all nodded in approval of what Private Lee said to Private Quing, with even the sergeant and corporal both saying, "That's right," in agreement. This all seemed to bring Private Quing back down to earth and calm his nerves a bit, as Quing was sometimes too gung-ho to where it blinded him to the realities they faced, causing him to slip into strange delusions of what heroism truly was. Perhaps it was better to make it home and be a hero instead of die to become a hero of China and Xi. Quing sat there, now in deep thought about the simple response of his friend Private Lee and the agreement of all the rest of his entire squad. All around, bullets and rockets, as well as missiles exchanged by both sides at one another, as well as the shells fired by the Chinese ZBD-04 infantry fighting vehicles and 120mm assault gun mortars, with the 130mm rockets also fired by the Fire Support Company in support of the mechanized infantry forces, now stopped in front of the second defense line. The apocalyptic combat was beyond harsh for the men in the vehicles, having such savagery erupting all around them, as the second line held for many hours, as it was now 4 hours into the fight, and now 3 a.m. on the third day. The Pakistanis captured the Pentagon and raised their nation's flag over the massive shell that remained of the structure, having been pounded by Pakistani artillery pieces placed on the top of the heights of the Arlington National Cemetery, giving their observers a direct panoramic view of the entire city from up there in certain parts. They set up their howitzers and fired them straight up in the air, with the most minimal charge put in each howitzer in order to hit their targets, their closer range targets like the Pentagon. This caused the shells to come straight down on top of it, similar to the effect of a mortar, but more massive as the 155 millimeter shells landed upon its roof, crashing into and destroying huge parts of the structure, leaving only the outermost walls mostly intact, albeit with the insides of the structure totally now gutted, to where the assaulting ground troops moving in afterwards to capture it had to fight through the rubble of the building against the last defenders who were holed up inside still. As for Pvt Li's company, they were giving the second defense line hell in vicious combat, although they were largely stymied by and being blocked by the obstacles that were too much to simply just blast away. They'd need either airstrikes or precision artillery to hit it, but they were too close for it to be safe or feasible within the current moment, as they had to keep up the pressure on the second line's defenders, as this belt needed to be worn down, even if done by nitty-gritty combat. Soon, the infantry troops would be ordered out from the relative safety within their APCs and IFVs, as they'd be ordered to begin to advance upon and capture fortify positions held by the Americans, essentially being tasked out to eliminate or capture enemy machine gun nests and other positions within the modern-day palisade that was the second defense line. This second belt had already claimed some vehicles and other companies within Pvt Li's overall battalion, including the disabled APC of his company that had already been hit. Other battalions in this area of the 92nd Infantry Division were also pressing their own assaults on the second line in other areas, including the 1 Tank Battalion of the 92nd, as the 1 Tank Battalion of the 93rd from earlier that was close by was now battling in the eastern suburbs, helping the rest of the 93rd's forces tasked with the capture of the whole east of the metro area, especially this area of major resistance. It would, however, be the 92nd Infantry Division who would be tasked with taking the regime quarter itself, the highest honor of all the places in the cap to be taken. Then the order came to disembark the vehicles and conduct a rolling shield maneuver all the way up to the outermost obstacles. The troops in the company all disembarked insofar as the dismounts in the troop cabs were concerned, leaving only the drivers and gunners once again as mobile fire support forces within their vehicles, as well as leaving the company's headquarters platoon within their vehicles there to provide any necessary logistical support or medical support. As the headquarters platoon of the company, their trucks and MRAPs were loaded down with extra ammo, fuel, food, water, and medical supplies, as well as even the maintenance squad carrying their tools and common extra vehicle parts and track sections for basic repairs in the field. The men followed their vehicles by squad and then were ordered over the radio helmet headsets to bound to the obstacles and take cover until further orders. The men obeyed their orders and bravely bounded forward, making for the first obstacles. They ran amid the machine gun fire, and now the blaring of a chorus of rifles joining in. Some of the men were hit, many in their chest plates of their armor, though. One was KIA'd and blown away by 50 cal ammo, tearing through the chest plate of his body armor and ripping the Chicom to bloody pieces in a blast of gore. The medics ran along with the assaulting squads of dismounted infantry. The sergeant of Pvt Li's squad was barking orders as the men hit the ground in the prone position upon reaching the end of their 50 meters dash. They lay before the former remains of what were once homes, torn down to their very foundations. Wire of the barbed and concertina varieties were strewn about and would considerably slow down any further advances from the advancing forces. The men were ordered to deploy grenades of barrel-fired but also hand varieties, as well as their Type 69 rocket-propelled grenade systems, of which they carried many anti-tank and anti-personnel rockets for those along with them. Also, they carried out some HJ-08 anti-tank missiles intended for enemy strongpoints that could be positively identified amid the rubbled defensive positions now in use by the American forces. The forces raised up every so often to fire their rifles and other weapons. Fortunate, those hit during the bounding and covering were in other platoons of Private Li's company, fortunately. Other companies along the second line assaulting it were doing the same thing. It was an attempt to storm the line in its overall length, but this would be obviously not a simple task by any stretch of the imagination. The nearest identifiable American position nearby was a sandbagged area amid a heap of ruins, which served as one of many fortifications along the line. Essentially, there was a former home's foundation. Actually, it was many foundations, of which the basements were converted into strong points, whereby the Americans made primitive walkways in said basements, which were elevated off the floor somewhat, to be able to shoot up and out of the basement, sort of like a rampart. The roof was a mess of different boards and plywood taken from amid the rubble and covered by large amounts of sandbags to protect from blasts and flying rounds. There were men lying in the prone on top of the boards as well, firing a machine gun through a gun port in the sandbags made by leaving a hole within the sandbag wall with a board laid on top of other sandbags of the wall with more sandbags piled on top of that board. So the M2 machine gun barrel could protrude from the hole to fire at approaching enemy forces. Rockets and heavy mortars hit all along the line, with blasts largely being ineffective against the fortifications which utilized basements in their primitive construction plans. However, occasionally, the 120 millimeter assault gun mortars or 130 millimeter rocket artillery from the Fire Support Company did manage to score direct hits upon the fortifications, although they weren't always enough to completely destroy them, with Americans moving between all the fortifications along the line, made of well-constructed basements amid the rubble, often used itself as the materials for walls and obstacles, and even piled atop of many of the fortifications as a means of shielding them from heavier munitions. Even so, sometimes the direct hits were enough to do the job, but sometimes not, all hinging upon whether or not the miniature bunkers were fortified well enough to endure them or not. The one that Private Li and his squad of his platoon of his company were assaulting was quite formidable, with its sandbag layers and well-placed rubble. They were now at an impasse for the time being, simply continuing the trading of fire with the Americans. Despite that, the vehicles now combined with the dismounted infantry, with the Fire Support Company throwing its weight in, definitely proved to be a devastating combination. Americans in these bunkers were fighting bravely against insane odds, truly insane odds, by every meaning of the words, as the Chinese PLA forces indeed kept up intense, hellish pressure upon this chain of fortifications. Bunkers continued trading fire as the Chicom infantry fired back, increasingly relying on their anti-tank missiles and RPG rockets, which laid waste to at least some of the top-level defenses in certain areas, although the basement bunkers proved themselves to be something difficult to overcome, as the obstacles blocked certain vectors of attack from view entirely, as well as many other obstructions, aiding both the defender, but also at times also the attacker, as obstructions soon would be dealt with by PLA combat engineer forces from the 92nd Infantry Division's headquarters battalion, who had a specialized company of combat engineers as part of its composition. As the fighting raged by the fortifications, the combat engineers finally began to arrive with a scissor bridge they began to lay further back away from the fighting, which kept them out of most of the fire, as it was mostly exchanged between the attacking mechanized infantry forces and the 2nd Defense Line's defenders. However, all the rounds fired from the defenders were still deadly out to 700 meters away, where the engineers began to lay the bridge from their engineering vehicle. Some of the other engineers, 2 platoons of the total 5 that came out of the entire company, were ordered to the battle line, where the intense fighting now raged between the opposing sides. The task of the engineers would be to use C4 to annihilate the various enemy obstacles in cooperation with the mechanized infantry forces now currently doing the fighting there. Being combat engineers by their very title contains their accurate description, carrying out engineering and demolitions while under fire, engaging in combat whilst conducting their trade. The 2 platoons of the company's 5 total comprising it came towards the area where Pvt Li's company was now engaged in savage combat of a type not yet experienced thus far in the invasion up till this point by the troops of Lee's company, much less his entire battalion. Of course, the other battalions were experiencing their own challenges, but this area of the line, being near such a key node of the defenses, was viciously contested, whereby the defender wanted to hold it at all costs, as much as the attacker didn't want to let up and off of it, in terms of the pressure now being placed upon it. Rockets of the 130 millimeter varieties continued flying, as did the 120 millimeter heavy mortars, crashing down upon American-held areas on and right behind the defense line. The shower of these rockets and mortars were attempting to deny the area for anyone to move in to reinforce or retreat out of it, or also even for logistics to make it to the defenders on the line. It was truly catastrophic, to where it came time did manage to hamper logistics, as the raining death ripped up the line and annihilated groups of men trying to run ammo to its bunkers. The sheer gravity of the situation called for all hands on deck among the defenders, even calling up men from underground in the subways and tunnels and sewers, as well as even bringing up some of the men that were already now occupying the 3rd line of defenses, there to reinforce the 2nd line as defenders began to fall by their dozens. Now it was 5 hours into the battle along the 2nd belt of defenses, and it was about to last for a very long time, as there would be unexpected turns of events, as the defenders would fight with great vigor and stamina to hold this defensive ring. There was an uncanny resemblance to the Battle of Berlin at the end of World War II, the last major battle of the war in Europe. Now very similar was this battle for the American cap city, totally leveled to its very foundations, smashed and then smashed again, over and over and over, by massed artillery and air raids, along with precision strikes from tactical ground attack aircraft, and even fighters retasked for ground attack missions. Upon there being no threat from the air from the Americans, as the USAF had been essentially, for all intents and purposes, annihilated largely on the ground on day one. Very few had been in the air at the time, and those that were promptly swatted down with very little effort by the Chicoms and their allies. The men fighting fired everything they had at each other, with the Chicoms taking cover in front of the obstacles, largely maintaining the prone position in order to avoid being totally shot up were they to dare to stand up at this point. Finally, as the two platoons of combat engineers managed to move up, they disembarked upon daringly pulling up their APCs past those of the Mech Infantry Company of Pvt Li's, and then releasing their dismounts to get to work on the obstacles. The engineers came fully equipped to deal with the issue, deploying their robots to begin cutting through the concertina and barbed wires to allow for the engineers to begin to place charges on the bigger obstacles in order to demolish them. They had heavily armored four-legged robots along with some on tracks of the old EOD designs. They all set out and began to work under fire, clipping and clearing the different wires of the concertina and barbed varieties, even as being hit by a machine gun and rifle fire. While the Americans focused on the bots clearing their obstacles, the mechanized infantry troops and the combat engineers fired upon the American positions. The robots' controllers operated the bots from the safety of the engineer company's command vehicle. The engineer troops filed in past the mechanized infantry forces in order to begin clearing the obstacles. One squad of engineers, under heavy fire, bounded at a pile of destroyed cars, impeding one of the streets leading to the strong points. This, along with the makeshift, cheap, improvised rubble dragon's teeth for being vehicle barriers. Bravely, the engineers and their robots began to plant charges on the obstacles, which the plastic explosives they had were very heavy duty and more than effective for taking on these barriers, since artillery and air power on the close by obstacles would have proven too dangerous due to the current positioning of the units in the area. The engineers would be the remedy for this situation, as precision planted charges would definitely do the job and be able to do so safely. The troops fired at the bunkers and fortifications as they also were working under fire. By radio, the mechanized infantry troops were told where to vector their fire so as to avoid any friendly fire incidences, as they too continued to help suppress the enemy. More and more, as their awesome firepower ground the Americans down little by little, as enemy positions being constantly hit were being eviscerated little by little, with fresh men attempting to rush in and replace the dead or wounded from the same fighting positions that had just been hit. These forces kept up the fight, pinning down the enemy who was, for now, bottlenecked and held at bay by the myriad of obstacles impeding their progress for the time being at the moment. There just then flew a TOW missile, which crashed into and destroyed another armor personnel carrier, which KIA'd the driver and also its gunner, but not the rest of the squad, who was by this point already dismounted and fighting near the obstacles. This came from Pvt Li's platoon, which was of the 4th squad of the 4 different squads that comprised this platoon. This snapped the men into reality, if all the other things going on already didn't. It was a determined enemy they were facing, one who held back their best resources for this defense line. The enemy also broke out their mortars, firing a few here and there before removing both the base plate and the tube, so as to avoid counter battery fire on their limited combat resources of the few mortar systems and mortars they actually had, which was to be used very sparingly. Several mortars had already claimed casualties among the Chicoms, causing 4 KIA and 10 WIAs. Private Lee so far was unharmed, aside from the sore ribs he had from taking a hit in his armor sappy chest plate at the bridge battle in the suburbs. He continued shooting. He knew the general target area, though in the fog of battle couldn't get an exact bead on anyone within the fortifications. In a combat situation such as this, one generally had a difficult time ascertaining where exactly specific enemies could be found. He simply fired at the sandbags and nearby rubble strewn on either side of the sandbag bunker area. The engineers, having already planted their charges, began to conduct a fighting withdrawal out of the area within the obstacles in order to rejoin their forces at the freshly laid scissor bridge far behind the current fighting, to defend the bridgehead from any potential counter-assaults from whatever forces could conceivably be in the area adjacent to the bridge on the other side of the Anacostia. Although the Americans right on the other side were holed up largely in the St. Elizabeth's complex now turned fortress and were barricaded within it for all intents and purposes. However, they began to fire on the bridgehead from St. Elizabeth's in order to attempt to hit the bridgehead with some of the 60mm mortars that they had in their defensive area, although without proper coordinates, had to try to walk them in, as the term went, to ascertain where they landed in order to readjust the fire to try to hit the scissor bridge area. The engineers re-entered their vehicles, leaving their turret gunners to guard the newly laid scissor bridge. This was done as a measure of protection for the dismounts against any type of mortar attacks which were now coming in. Meanwhile, the radio gave the command to keep their heads down and that the engineers would detonate their charges momentarily, and they'd give the all clear over the radio once it was safe to proceed with their attack. Minutes later, "Fire in the hole!" came a loud yell into the radio, going to all the forces in the field of Private Lee's company and others, where the engineers had worked to clear the obstacles for an attempted breakthrough to allow mainly Private Lee's company to proceed to take the bunkers. Came an enormous single blast, seemingly, as all the planted charges went off near simultaneously. So powerful was the blast, even though it was safe due to how the charges were planted according to the engineers' calculations, that it threw all the obstacles virtually in the air and all back towards the enemy's fortifications, as the charges planted were arranged in such a way as to blast backward toward the second defense line and away from the attacking PLA troops. As intense as the blasting was, it stunned the enemy momentarily, as it was indeed a literal shock to their senses, leading them temporarily to cease fire, due to being stunned by the noise and miniature earthquake caused in their immediate vicinity, which was fully taken advantage of by the PLA troops of Private Lee's attacking company, as they were ordered to charge and take the bunkers. They formed into wedge formations for their attack from the single line formation they now currently were in the prone position, and proceeded through the path created for them by the engineers, who managed to level an entire 300 by 400 meter area of obstacles, opening a decent pathway not only for the infantry to advance forward, but also for the formerly bottlenecked vehicles of the PLA to proceed with them. The fire poured down upon the American positions was truly merciless, as not only did the massive infantry dismounted PLA troops open fire with all they had, but so did their accompanying vehicles of their company moving up right behind them, minus the two that had been destroyed or disabled. The vehicles vectored their fire from behind the advancing troops, but did so safely by firing only through gaps between the wedges, informing via radio where they needed to move to avoid any types of friendly fire incidents. The combo of all the firepower after the shock of the demolition was intense, but the defenders regained some of their composure, attempting to regain some sort of initiative while on the defense. They fired back with men moving into the area from both emerging above ground from the metro sewers and tunnels, but also as well as from the area of and around the 3rd Defense Line. There were corpses all over, from deceased defenders cut down by the light artillery, the shells fired by the IFVs and anti-tank and anti-personnel rockets, and anti-tank missiles earlier fired by the infantry fighting vehicles, AT pods, and the ground troops from their tripod or shoulder-mounted anti-tank missiles. The 120 millimeter assault gun mortars still landed along with the shower of 130 millimeter rockets from the fire support company, thus making the defenders' operations exceedingly difficult under the withering firepower. Bounding and covering amid the small remaining rubble piles, mostly only a few feet tall now, and no longer able to obstruct PLA movement, now served as temporary cover positions for the troops kneeling or in the prone position whenever stopping to provide covering fire for the other wedge formations of bounding squads. They'd all leapfrogged while cover firing for one another whenever the others moved. Occasionally, some rifle or machine gun fire hit PLA soldiers as they were advancing, but most were hit in their armor, and fortunately not by 50 cal ammo, which saved their lives, as the 50 cal had been knocked out of commission. Pvt Li laid down heavy fire as he stopped with his wedge, his squad, to provide covering fire for the other wedges bounding forward. It was done by 2 squads per platoon bounding forward with 2 covering them, back and forth, moving forward. By now, they moved into within 100 meters of the first bunkers in the sector, with the main stronghold being the heavily sandbagged bunker fired at from the beginning. At some point in the fight, the 50 cal on top of the basement part on the first floor area had been entirely wiped out, as it had been hit by a shell from one of the ZBD-04 infantry fighting vehicles, having lobbed a 100 millimeter shell and many 30 millimeter autocannon rounds at that area, blasting open the sandbagged wall and killing everyone above, and even some that were below in the basement upon the blasts of the 100 millimeter shell and the many 30 millimeter blasting tip rounds. The heavy amount of sandbags utilized was the only reason why even just a handful of defenders had managed to survive. However, some 45 defenders occupying that bunker and surrounding area had totally been blown into pieces by the massive ordnances laid down on the area upon saturating it with concussive shrapnel-filled tornadoes of annihilation. The remaining defenders were essentially just a handful of riflemen, as well as a few that had a couple AT-4s, now firing them frantically, amid their riflemen trying desperately to stop the now charging Chicom forces, all to no avail. The AT-4s crashed into some of the Chicom vehicles, but destroyed none of them, only causing minor damages due to the up-armored ERA or applique armor kits added to them. Only a handful of APCs didn't have this done to them, but most of the vehicles going into the urban warfare situations had the armor added with such warfare in mind as was currently being experienced. Finally, one AT-4 crashed into and blew apart the tracks on a ZBD-04 infantry fighting vehicle, which for the time being disabled it, requiring a mechanic to hurry out to start repairs on the tracks. However, with the whole swarm of the company's remaining 13 vehicles out of their original 16 from the 4 combat platoons, minus, of course, the headquarters platoon's vehicles, it was too little too late. The forces continued their advance, continuing to lay down heavy fire, preparing to enter the fortifications themselves and conduct close quarters combat with the American enemy. It was now over 5 hours into the attack itself, and the battle raged all around, with the raging of gunfire continuing unceasingly. The men were now reaching their target, the bunkers and fortifications in their immediate zone of attack. The forces dropped into the prone position upon reaching the walls of rubble comprising the edges of the fortifications themselves, and tossed in some hand grenades down into the basement level, with the ringing of the blast surging within the basement of the main bunker complex, which was several basements with the walls between them all knocked out and topped with the wood-covered sandbags and added rubble for extra protection from smaller shells and munitions. This, however, didn't hold against light artillery scoring direct hits, as it happened a few times, whereby it caused extra men to be rushed in to replace those who had been KIA'd in such attacks, in order that the defense line could be upheld in the face of the savage PLA assault. This same event was occurring throughout the area, as other battalions were having a more difficult go at it, as the combat engineers were unable to make it yet to other sectors of the line, still filled with obstacles of all kinds, which had massively impeded their progress, far worse than what had been faced on the first defense line days before. Pvt Li deployed another grenade, even though several had by this point been tossed down into the structure. There now had been a total cessation of fire support companies' rockets and assault gun/mortar systems, as they needed to avoid friendly fire while the troops fought clearing actions on the second defense line, now a hotly contested close quarters combat zone. All throughout its length, this particular area wasn't even as built up as some of the other portions of the second line were, as this particular section near St. Elizabeth's utilized that compound as its local strong point, which originally was to be able to support the surrounding areas nearby on the second line and offer fire support for them. However, with the Belarusian attack coming from the south, while the mechanized infantry battalion in which Pvt Li served hit from the north, but from across the Anacostia from St. Elizabeth's, hence the need to capture the toll bridge while still remaining right behind the second defense line, or to cross the Scissor Bridge to assault St. Elizabeth's via that option. Now that the Scissor Bridge had been laid at virtually the same time as the attack was pressed on the second line in front of the toll bridge, it was opted now to simply assault the line here and also have other companies of the battalion diverted across the Scissor Bridge, whilst several others of the battalion, including Pvt Li's, fought for control of the toll bridge by breaking through this part of the line. "Go, move! My squad, storm the bunker!" yelled Pvt Li's squad sergeant as he stood up with the rest of his squad, including Pvt Li, upon relaying the order from the platoon sergeant as he had received it via the sergeant's radio headset in his helmet. The men all formed into 2 columns upon obeying their sergeant's hand signs, and filed into 5-man stack teams and rushed onto the top of the bunker basements, onto the sandbag and rubble-covered wood boards, which was now dangerous from all the battle damage incurred, so the men had to carefully watch their step. They dropped down into the basement bunkers through makeshift stairwells, whereby they seen makeshift platforms on a two-tier system to allow for the original defenders to be able to stand upon these to shoot over top of the basement wall and also to return back to cover quickly if needed. Corpses littered the room in the dozens. Many had fallen here within the past 5 hours, but it wasn't over yet, not even close. There was shooting still going on. As the men emerged after carefully clearing the bunker, the other combat platoons of the company were now in a continued firefight, trying to now repel a counterattack done by the Americans. This, as reinforcements for the now deceased defenders on the line had finally shown up. Originally, they were to replenish the defenders' dwindling numbers. Now they had to attempt to retake this breach in the second defense line. The shooting only having barely died down as the men started to clear the bunkers, rose back up again. It was now a vicious struggle between the 4 combat platoons out of Pvt Li's company, minus, of course, the headquarters platoon sitting further back, as the American reinforcements now counter-assaulted in force. They came even with an MRAP, surprisingly, and some came on gators and other all-terrain vehicles, not to mention many on foot, nearly 50 of them or so, but the total was 70 when including those mounted up in the vehicles. The gunner on the turret of the MRAP was operating another M250 cal machine gun and began to blow sandbags into dust as the huge rounds tore through the first sandbags and the triple sandbagged walls atop the bunkers, which caused splashes of dirt and debris all over the place as those PLA troops atop and on the other side of the bunker complex dropped down to take cover. Upon temporarily stopping, the back hatch of the MRAP slowly dropped, allowing more troops to race out of the back, who began to move tactically in a squad-sized wedge formation, running into action with the other foot soldiers already moving, all of them bounding for cover behind rubble heaps that used to be buildings and piles of burned-up vehicles set a little ways back where the original street used to be, and on the opposite side of the second defense line's basement bunker system. The former neighborhood was totally gone, eviscerated like most of the rest of the city, with nothing left but rubble. However, these piles made great fighting positions for attacker and defender alike. Americans across the street from the smashed homes that were turned into defensive bunkers tossed grenades at the PLA troops upon cooking them for a few seconds before then quickly heaving them at Pvt Li and his comrades. Pvt Li took a position behind rubble and sandbags laying on a few of the plywood sandbag-covered boards, not daring to lift his head over the triple-plied sandbag wall for fear of having it blown apart by all of the flying rounds overhead and 50 cal rounds splashing into the first layer of sandbags, throwing up dirt everywhere, as shown by the tracer rounds exceedingly close by overhead. "Pvt Li, throw a grenade, now!" yelled the corporal, the next most ranking man in Pvt Li's squad below the squad's sergeant. Pvt Li nodded one time and pulled out his last grenade and heaved it over the pile of smashed brick and concrete and sandbags of the short wall of the top part above the basement bunker complex. The others fired their Type 69 rocket-propelled grenades, as well as those still having any hand grenades left, or barrel-mounted grenades, deploying them too. One of the squads had a man with an HJ-08 anti-tank missile who went to use it against the MRAP, but was immediately torn through his body armor by the 50 cal's massive rounds, as it literally ripped the man in half almost upon blasting his upper chest and tearing through and out the other end, armor and all. The HJ-08 fell, but no one dared try to risk their lives to reach out and pick it up. Hold on, y'all. Stupid computer. It skipped on me. Hold on. As all the the HJ-08 fell, but no one dared try to risk their lives to reach out and pick it up, as all the PLA troops stayed low, below cover, only shooting through whenever their rifles could protrude from, or rarely raising their heads, only high enough to quickly aim and fire a short 1 to 2 second burst, all in random order, so as to avoid drawing the ire of the 50 cal gunner on top of the MRAP. The platoon's lieutenants and platoon sergeants over each platoon called their vehicles forward via radio headsets, but they had to maneuver up to the fortifications, as the basements of such prevented them from proceeding any further, as these former homes, now turned into bunkers, would get the vehicles stuck if they tried rolling through the area to assault the Americans. The guns of the infantry fighting vehicles now began to lay waste to enemy ground troops some 8 minutes into the firefight, but the Americans by now were well protected amid all the rubble and used it to their best advantage by putting themselves in positions where piles of it would shield troops from the shrapnel and blast waves of the 30 millimeter, and in some cases, the much larger 100 millimeter shells. However, over a dozen Americans had been cut down who had revealed their positions or strayed out of better cover. This was a big aid to the PLA troops who'd possibly stayed pinned down longer had their vehicles been unable to move up close enough to help. By this point, Americans from closer parts of the second defense line began to also show up to help patch this hole in their lines. Coming from the right side of the south-facing PLA troops, they started to actually almost successfully outflank the PLA forces currently sitting on this former segment of their defense line by firing anti-tank weapons at the vehicles now parked up in front of it, hitting one of the ZBD-04's IFVs from its side, but couldn't penetrate its added ERA armor kit, which prevented any serious damage being done to it, causing the vehicle to turn its turret and fire off in that direction at where the smoke trail was detected by its IR thermal imaging systems. However, the Americans coming from the front and side were quite actually fairly formidable, mostly because the weapons and numbers they attacked with were adequate to actually cause the PLA's forces to pull back for a regrouping attempt, as the wounded were being retrieved, and so were the 10 deceased among them, as the heavy fighting here had ended up being somewhat costly compared to previous fighting earlier in the battle for the city. The men conducted a fighting retreat and entered the backs of their APCs and IFVs, and ended up rolling backwards as the turret gunners on the APCs fired their heavy 12.7 millimeter machine guns, as well as the IFVs firing their larger weapons as well. They did damage to the counterattacking American forces as they retreated back 400 meters to their original starting point, away from the bunkers they'd just entered. They had to regroup and come up with another assault plan, as the Americans had moved heavy reinforcements in to plug the gap in the line. As this occurred, other PLA companies within Pvt Li's whole battalion had begun to cross the Anacostia River over the Scissor Bridge that was freshly just erected and now guarded by the Combat Engineer Company out of the headquarters battalion belonging to the whole 92nd Infantry Division. These forces were to hit St. Elizabeth's through the north, since the line, unable as of yet to be totally penetrated to reach the toll bridge, to move at it from that direction. Sgt Richardson, stuck in the basement of the St. Elizabeth's compound, had delivered his message to the Brigadier General in the basement's makeshift command room, albeit a bit too late, as the recently stopped artillery barrage had signaled such. Already, he had to find a way out, but it was too dangerous to return the way he had originally entered the complex. The second defense line was under assault from the north, as well as now from the south as well. Reports came in from the southern edge of the St. Elizabeth's compound that Belarusian armor had been spotted and appeared to be moving closer and closer. There were T-72B3Ms headed this way, tanks moving in to assault the compound, along with their accompanying mechanized infantry grenadier forces belonging to their same armored battalion, there to support their armored forces. Sgt Richardson was to relay a message to the command at their new command post at the Jefferson Memorial, just discovered now to be where the Joint Chiefs of Staff had evacuated from the Pentagon via another messenger, bringing the message just after the barrage had ceased, while entering from the south right before the Belarusians had moved in to attack. The several messengers, with Sgt Richardson included, were all given the message to send back to the Joint Chiefs that St. Elizabeth's was now being hit from the north and south simultaneously, and that PLA forces had just laid a scissor bridge north of the second defense line, as well as trying to take the toll bridge, which would sever American connections to the northwest of the Anacostia River. This would present a massive issue for the city's defenses if completed. There was also a request for more reinforcements and even more ammo, despite having been fairly well stocked, with even enough for days of fighting. Reinforcements wouldn't be coming, as the only reinforcements that could even be mustered for the current time were being sent to currently plug the small gap that now just appeared in the second line, adjacent to the toll bridge area across the river from the St. Elizabeth's complex. The forces in St. Elizabeth's wouldn't be able to help the other parts of the second line close by as originally intended, mostly because of the now unfolding attack. It was so intense that it was all hands on deck just to hold this complex. The Brigadier General in command told Sgt Richardson good luck, as it related to him leaving the complex alive to return to the Joint Chiefs, as many messengers had already reached their demise, and all things considered, with the enemy right up on top of the second defense line, it was well understood that the situation was growing much worse than it already had been. The fighting occurring outside picked up with intensity as well, as Sgt Richardson and the other messengers emerged to return to their dirt bikes, as these were the most efficient means of travel through the rubbled city streets. as they were less prone to wear and tear than a traditional motorcycle would be in such circumstances. Upon reaching the top of the stairs, still within the building itself, there was shouting and shooting, heard louder and louder, as it all hit a crescendo. "Enemy tanks at the gate!" screamed a man, while running through the lobby door before running down the steps of the stairs out front, ostensibly to brief commanders of in the briefing and map rooms. The machine gun nest immediately in the front lobby was on red alert for trouble, there to mow down any enemies that might somehow break through the main front door into the building. Others ran to and fro in the halls of the first floor of the building, many with weapons at the ready. Sgt Richardson opened the front double doors and went out into the front of the building. The guards outside, in front of the doors, were now down in foxholes on either side of the concrete landing which led into the building, which hadn't been noticed by Sgt Richardson on his way in, as the dark skies and lack of fighting when he first arrived prevented him from seeing the foxholes themselves. Now the blasts of the tank shells were heard with thunderous booms, as these fragmentation HE shells were akin to smaller artillery shells, throwing shrapnel and debris and smoke everywhere that they crashed into. There were anti-tank missiles also being fired, both from the American side, but also from the Belarusian forces also, and the PLA, who was now showing up from the north. This was heralded by a squad of men running around the building to go through the front door to brief the command about this development. They'd crossed officially, now, the Scissor Bridge. This was a horrible situation, which was certainly an understatement of the sheer severity of the now unfolding events. The forces by the front gate of the entire smashed compound, most of whose massive buildings had been smashed into piles or husks or ruins, minus the main medieval facade appearing structure and a few others near it, were firing their weapons, but falling back little by little in backwards, leapfrogging, bounding and covering, running from cover point to cover point. The forces outside the front gate had all been KIA'd already, with some of the wounded trying to slip away into the complex among those retreating, but couldn't keep up and were mowed down by heavy turret and coax machine guns on the tanks leading the attack, two abreast in a double column of vehicles, as they had to smash down the obstructions around the gate, which they did with ease, crushing the already partially blasted away brick wall on either side of the road moving into the complex, which constituted the gate, surrounded by anti-tank ditches dug into the soil on either side. There were 2 rows of such, with the second anti-tank ditch being even closer to the edges of the road than the first outer perimeter ditch, hence why the tanks proceeded in 2 columns, but would even need to become a single column where the road narrowed a bit once inside of the complex. The forces moved in through the gate, firing shells continuously before a Javelin anti-tank missile, which had been fired from one of the many fighting positions, knocking out one of the 2 leading T-72s pushing the attack, which, with little choices but to press forward the attack into the complex, as it would be exceedingly difficult to back up the whole battalion's tanks and mechanized infantry companies of the entire battalion, who all were partaking in this assault as a single battalion effort, as the three other battalions of Belarusians that were further to the south were holding the recently captured naval installation on the Potomac, as well as blocking the eastern suburbs in from the west of them, but south of the St. Elizabeth's complex, where their tank battalion was now fully engaged in trying to seize it, with the PLA hitting it from the north, which would lead to seriously crippling the second defense line if successful. Should the area fall, it would lead to the invasion forces being able to move onto and crush the third line, while then being able to bypass and surround what would then be left of the second line and all its defenders stuck in it. Of course, the Americans were doing all they could to prevent this from happening too soon. It was obviously a foregone conclusion that the Americans wouldn't be able to hold on forever, but there was no choice but to try to buy as much time as possible and put forth the effort. Sergeant Richardson raced off to the side of the road, suddenly ditching his dirt bike for the moment, jumping into a nearby trench. The forces already in this trench were elevated slightly above other trenches on a grade, a gently rolling hill that sat on the complex, that allowed for several belts of trenches, sprinkled also with foxholes amid all the artillery craters, and also those from pinpoint airstrikes earlier in the invasion over a day or so ago. The forces had anti-tank emplacements for tow systems, as well as individuals who carried AT-4s on their person, and also several dozens of javelins. The tactics to be employed against this attacking force was to lure them a bit into the complex, just a bit more, until the lead tank would be right on the stretch of road between the two anti-tank ditches that lay inside of the property. So then it could block the road, allowing for the rest of the tanks within the entrance to be even easier to destroy, causing blockage all the way to the first anti-tank ditch on the outer perimeter of the property. The PLA attacked by taking a bypass road just to the north of the compound property, whereby they would turn off of it and seek a way to move across the anti-tank ditch on the outer perimeter, or simply drive a bit further to the east, coming in the other entrance after following the perimeter around to reach it. The front was a hellish combat zone, with the tanks letting their guns go full bore onto the defenders of the complex, with several shells crashing into parts of the castle-like main building, although the Belarusian commanders told their subordinate companies and their leadership, including the ones leading the attack, not to hit the building for propaganda purposes. It'll look good on film with the Belarusian flag being hoisted on top of its keep-like front tower, looking like a castle's keep. This saved at least the defense command's structure they were using, but it didn't help the men outdoors in the trenches, as shells and machine gun fire poured down upon their positions. Sergeant Richardson, of course, himself had joined in, as no other choices currently presented themselves, so he fought with tenacity, akin to what he'd already undergone for the past few days of fighting, firing his rifle, trying to snipe at the tank turret gunners was no easy task, as they had turret shielding, but there'd already been a few who'd been struck atop of a few of the other tanks now pouring in through the main entrance behind the lead tanks, one of which was destroyed by a javelin so far. Now came the firing of a tow system and also a javelin from someone else, almost near simultaneously, both hitting the first T-72 as it began to reach the section of road flanked on both sides by the anti-tank ditches, one on each side. It was done. The tank's turret blew off of it up into the air before landing upside down in the ditch to the right of the now smoking hulk of metal, which was the destroyed T-72 tank, which now instantly became a massive roadblock. It was on now. The others, with anti-tank systems, began to use them much more liberally, picking off each tank behind the crippled tank now blocking the way in. As the minutes ticked by one, each tank in the column was destroyed, leading all the way at least to the front gate itself, where they blocked now the whole way into the complex for any more vehicles to enter. 20 minutes had elapsed from the time the second tank kill happened, which blocked the path across the innermost tank ditches, till the rest were wiped out to the outer perimeter anti-tank ditches, which turned the situation into a more long-distance battle, whereby the enemy was at closest about 300 meters away from the Americans, nearer to the end of the perimeter itself, and about 500 meters from those furthest inside, and even 700 meters away now from the main building itself that housed the commanders of the local defenses. Nowhere near being over. All this development did was buy badly needed time to try to hold out a bit longer. A bit of breathing room overall. Perhaps it could be said, however, the PLA was attacking now vigorously, attacking from the north, as 3 whole companies of the closest PLA battalion, a mechanized infantry battalion out of the 31st Group Army's 92nd Infantry Division, began to lob anti-tank missiles and shells and autocannon ammo from infantry fighting vehicles, as well as machine gun and rifle fire, of course, and even fire support from the light artillery of the battalion's fire support company, sending 130 millimeter rockets and 120 millimeter heavy assault gun / mortar rounds crashing into the complex, seemingly just at the moment when Sgt Richardson contemplated getting up to carry on with the mission of returning deeper into the city to report to the Joint Chiefs of Staff within the Jefferson Memorial, their new ad hoc command headquarters and operations center. It was still too dangerous from the front, as machine gun rounds from the tanks and more shells continued to come in, also signifying how unsafe the leaving would be, as the many remaining tanks and mechanized infantry forces also out in front of the compound had now shifted their attack positions, readjusting their vehicle formation to re-vector their entire attack in such a way to where they would all be able to fire their weapons in near instantaneous continuous line, facing in towards the St. Elizabeth compound from outside of its property's defensive perimeters. The volleys of tank shells, autocannon, and 100 millimeter guns from the Belarusian IFVs and machine gun fire and occasional anti-tank missiles from them also, sort of like the PLA, was totally devastating upon the grounds and many defenders therein. Many were cut down by the hail of fire from both the Belarusian and PLA attackers, but most were already keeping their heads down in anticipation of the coming hell to pay for stopping the armored spearhead leading into the campus through the front. This phase went on for nearly several hours until the sun began to rise around 8 a.m. Despite the intensity Of all the heavy ensuing attacks of the forces to the north and south, there had been a lull in the fighting sometime after 8 a.m., which meant that they were most likely replenishing ammunition and logistics, which was a better time than ever for Sergeant Richardson to look for a way out of there. Although the vast majority of the slew of ordnance and rounds blasting and splashing and shredding upon the grounds, respectively, had substantially slowed down, it hadn't completely ceased, just merely lessened to more sporadic bursts of rifle and machine gun fire with intermittent shellings and occasional anti-tank missiles and rockets fired from both the Belarusian troops as well as from the PLA sitting in the north of the campus. It was time to leave, so the way out was to go through the anti-tank ditch and race across the toll bridge, which would indeed be a hell of a challenge. The Belarusian troops were blocking the main entrance, with the PLA blocking the secondary entrance. Soon, they'd be trying to make for the toll bridge themselves, but would have to smash through the St. Elizabeth's complex defenses, including those that stretched out to the river, covering the adjacent Thruway Road, a 4-lane semi-highway that passed between the campus and the river itself of the Anacostia River. It was heavily fortified by barricades and obstacles that covered both the north and south, stretching between the campus and river like two arms. Sergeant Richardson got up and out of the trench and moved to get back on his dirt bike. None of the other troops said a single word in the trench as he got up to leave, all of which exhibited symptoms of shell shock from the waves of withering firepower between all the barrages of artillery, strategic air raids, and tactical ground attack strikes as well, and now the tandem assault by Belarusian and PLA forces. He rode down the street and off of it and headed to the west towards the anti-tank ditch perimeter of the main campus en route to the thruway and then toll bridge back across the Anacostia. He took one look at the second ring of anti-tank ditches. It was dug deep, about 14 feet and in a V shape, to where any vehicle attempting to cross would fall in and get stuck. He couldn't take the dirt bike and would have to proceed on foot. He could climb it, but it would take a lot of energy, and he had to pass through both of the anti-tank ditches, the inner and outer. There were no other choices, as the other ways were now currently blocked off by enemy forces. Thus, he set out to surmount these obstacles, leaving his means of transport behind. He would have to acquire new transport upon reaching the other friendly forces, with such means available to offer to him. The other messengers had, of course, been faced with the same issues, and had adapted and overcame. One messenger had actually jumped into the river and swam across to the regime quarter due to being shot at by the recently approaching Belarusian armored forces who were now attacking the southern perimeter area. Others had also crossed the anti-tank ditches upon the cessation of the massive first wave of assault. So too did Sergeant Richardson, as he now climbed out of the innermost ditch system and now was sliding down into the outer one. As he climbed to its top, he could see the others who had done the same running out in the thoroughfare, crossing it to reach the toll bridge. He soon moved to race after them, trying to keep up Although it was generally unwise for them all to stick together as messengers, lest they all be mowed down by enemy fire and thereby never transmit their messages. Even so, what other choice was there? Currently, they'd been funneled into the same escape route, the only escape route. "Wait!" yelled Sergeant Richardson as the others looked back and slowed down slightly into a jog, waiting for Sergeant Richardson to hurry and catch up to them. "Come on, soldier!" yelled one of the men to Sergeant Richardson, to which he responded, "Roger, moving!" as he ran. The man Sergeant Richardson responded to in the affirmative was a staff sergeant, merely one rank right above his own. The two men, now running at a brisk pace with several others in tow, began to discuss the current situation and how now to get back to the regime quarter by utilizing the underground routes of the city, and discussed taking the green line of the metro all the way to the city center before then switching off to the Blue Line tunnel to take it straight to the Jefferson Memorial via the Smithsonian Metro station, to then emerge on foot to report to the S4 of the Joint Chiefs at their new command headquarters there. The five men ran across the bridge with seeing scenes of destruction all around them. The morning air was foggy, but it wasn't a natural fog. It was from all the dust and debris now floating in the air from all the recent fighting that had occurred throughout the immediate vicinity. Between the second line across the toll bridge along with St. Elizabeth's right behind them. Observing the area upon crossing the toll bridge, there were piles of rubble tossed to and fro from other places where the rubble once was. Thus was the power of all the expended ammunition and ordnance recently used to attempt to take the second line of defense. However, due to a successful counterattack by the Americans, won the fortifications back along the line, right back into their possession, though nearly lost just a few hours earlier. PLA troops who'd managed to destroy a 300 by 400 meter area of obstacles in front of the fortifications, done via careful demolition through the use of combat engineer troops, followed up with an assault by mechanized infantry forces, nearly had broken through completely through the line at this point along the belt of fortifications and obstacles that comprised the entire second belt of defenses. Many pieces of corpses littered the area, many blasted into gory, bloody pieces of meat wrapped in pieces of uniform lay strewn about the area. Some bodies were simply riddled with bullet holes, too, resembling hamburger meat with a Swiss cheese effect to them. Sergeant Richardson and others quickly averted their eyes as they ran by the area, now held by a cluster of new troops that had come in to fill the void created by the devastating PLA attack which had just recently occurred here. All the men were hiding amid rubbled positions or the retook positions within the basement bunker complexes that the PLA had just fought for control over within this particular sector. The new men couldn't even fiddle around with the dead and trying to bury them or identify them, as they had to scan the battle line for potential new assaults, as they knew the PLA would be trying again soon, as they were obviously now replenishing their logistics and temporarily resting and recuperating from the recent intense combat they'd just undergone here. Indeed, PLA commanders were planning an even bigger assault, seeing as to how strong the American defenses actually were in this part of the city. No longer a cakewalk like the fighting had been up until hitting the inner defenses. Sergeant Richardson and the other men found a way into the underground via a sewer which connected with the Green Line subway tunnel. Men entered and left the manhole cover, now slid open for the time being for easy entry and exiting. They entered and moved amid the sewer, finding a man down in there guarding a door to a maintenance tunnel, which led to the Green Line subway tunnel. He gave them directions so they'd arrive there with no issues, and the men thanked him as they passed into the maintenance tunnel. Now they were safe from air and artillery strikes for the time being, and there to have been any, or was there to have been any, while underground. They entered the Green Line tunnel through a red painted door. The underground world seemed quite the contrast to the above ground one. So many people were underground, most of the city's population trying to seek refuge from the fighting and steady artillery and aerial bombardment above. It was surreal realizing the quasi-peace of the underground compared to the steady warring forces above slugging it out with one another. Only, though, to realize that there were still even some above ground civilians attempting and trying to hide and somehow survive and eke out a living amid the husks and shells of buildings and rubbled basements. Those who never fled underground, at least, were doing these things. Seeing all the refugees who were now hiding in the underground and smelling the awful smells of all the people stinking from the combo of body odors of thousands upon thousands of them, mixed with the smell of feces as buckets were used in many areas as makeshift sanitation within the tunnels, as very few public restrooms existed within the tunnels except where subway stations were. These were having plenty of issues by this point, with no way to flush due to the grid being shut off by the Chinese cyber attacks. The urinals were the only things that could have been used, as gravity allowed for the urine to go down the drains. The stench was intense, but the men weathered it all and passed all the refugees, even past military areas where troops rested upon cots in the safety of these deep underground tunnels, or were eating MREs that, or because cooked food was generally running out everywhere. However, MREs were still around and in massive quantities, so much so the civilians were handed them to sustain them as well, since this was one resource that there actually had been plenty of in the city's warehouses and installations, among other places. It was a government staple, more or less. Also, the other resources in abundance were all the different common calibers of small arms ammo purchased in freakishly massive quantities over the years by the regime as well. Crates of ammo were all throughout the tunnels, and different headquarters buildings of all the various alphabet paramilitary forces throughout the city as well. The military forces had their own small arms ammunition, but should they get low on theirs, they could sponge off of the massive stocks of 5.56 and 9mm that the paramilitary forces had acquired for such a long time. Mostly, the paramilitary forces used a lot of 40 cal as pistol rounds, as well as some 45 and in some cases also 9mm, but did also use 5.56 like the regular military did for their rifles as well. Now the men turned onto the blue line and began to head north and towards the Smithsonian station as they walked through the packed subway tunnels. In another hour, they'd finally arrived. They left the station and walked up the inoperative escalators to the mall area. It was full of activity, but only that the trained eye could be able to spot. There were troops crawling all throughout the mall, but moving around in freshly dug up earthworks in the formerly grassy mall area. It was now a mix of fortifications made in the ground, intermixed with craters from earlier air and artillery strikes upon the area. The monuments were largely left standing, though were battle damaged from collateral damage. The monuments were purposely left alone so as to use them for later Chicom and coalition propaganda in their victory films and pictures and art that would be made to commemorate such a monumental victory over what was now the most hated nation on earth. This, of course, was the case due to all the past meddling around the world in the affairs of other lands and peoples, but also because of its dealings with giving its enemies ever more reasons to go to war, to both finish it off, but also plunder its enemy for everything it had left. China and Russia would be those who would mainly benefit, but others would be paid handsomely in the spoils of war or other rewards by China for staying to assist in their colonial ambitions. Russia, however, would be staying to help their ally, but only for a time before withdrawing to the north of their territory, as agreed upon with China in their partitioning of the North American continent into two different colonies. The forces were digging more foxholes and making hastily constructed emplacements for machine guns, anti-tank positions, as well as traps and obstacles. Also, a few mortar pits among the myriad of earthworks also included. The last line of defenses, the third line, and final stand position. Even the presidential residence and Cap building at the other end of the mall were incorporated into the third defense line. Both were to be hard points, even as the surviving regime leaders took shelter in the bunkers beneath both large buildings, while the generals above across the mall and the Jefferson Memorial continued to run the war and the city's defenses. With the Pentagon freshly captured, with the Pakistani flag flying proudly above it, the humiliated American generals could only look across the Potomac in shame that they had lost their grand old home. The massive monolith had been the home of the Department of Defense for many decades since its construction, and was now vengefully in the hands of a nation who hated America for what it did in its part of the world. Also, being closely allied with China made Pakistan participate in the foreign expeditionary invasion forces of the Sino-Russian coalition to help China and harm a hated foe, two birds with one stone, so to speak. The Supreme Court already had the Chinese flag and party flag of the CCP regime also waving above it, a sign of Chinese domination, with more to come. Seeing the flags of enemy nations waving so close by over formerly American power centers in these shells of structures made morale sink to an all-time low, but what other choice was there but to fight on? For many Americans, not merely those in the Cap region, this would be a long-haul sort of ordeal, whereby only the strong would make it, and only those with stamina and raw endurance would also make it, and that being largely those who believed in the Most High God, who would refuse to worship Xi Jinping in a Chicom Laogai. The messengers, including Sgt Richardson, reached the Jefferson Memorial and went into the top portion, where there were desks all set up in the monument area, as opposed to the underground portion where the maintenance areas were. With people now utilizing typewriters as if it was World War I or World War II again. This, due to the cyber attacks shutting everything down, of course. They were typing operation orders or op orders and messages and keeping track of activity in different defensive sectors to type out intelligence reports or SITREPs, situation reports. They hacked away at the keys, a steady, muffled tapping sound. S4 was located in the north-facing portion of the interior part of the memorial. The men all approached, to give their status reports and relay information from commanders to the Joint Chiefs. The messengers were then temporarily dismissed and told to go grab some chow and some water and return in 3 hours for new missions of delivering new messages. Sgt Richardson wondered, and he couldn't help but wonder, would the regime quarter even still be in American hands in 3 more hours? He truly hoped so, because he would hate to even imagine the alternative. As the handful of regime cronies and local uber-rich hid in the presidential and other bunkers nearby, in the dimly lit confines of such places, were all going crazy thinking of their ultimate fates, as they knew they'd have pure hell in the hands of the Chicoms. Many of them were delusional by this point and exhibited symptoms of cabin fever and outright madness. They were only going to remain relatively protected for so long until the third line above them fell and the city surrendered. For now, they had a little time left to remain uncaptured, but that time would delineate their ultimate fate as ending up in the hands of the PLA, much like Saddam Hussein ending up in their hands many years before. The irony of the situation was palpable, and would be, in the literal meaning of the word, very soon, as they'd be pulled out and humiliated in like fashion. The general staff now spread out and commanding various defenses around the city, and Joint Chiefs themselves vowed, however, to go out swinging. However, this wouldn't be the case with all of them, as some would have a sudden change of heart and lose their nerve and surrender as things became even more hopeless than they already were. Very much so indeed, this situation within the American cap city resembled the Battle of Berlin in 1945 in many regards and aspects. End of part 22.